welcome to this evening's lecture, part of the 2023 Follow the River lecture series, hosted by the Hudson River Maritime Museum and sponsored by Rondout Savings Bank. I'm Michael Porio, the education coordinator, and our Woolen River volunteer Leslie Drojak is helping me tonight. We are happy to be your hosts this evening. Before we begin, can I ask you to silence your cell phones? Thank you. The Hudson River Maritime Museum is a 501c3 not-for-profit. We do not receive funds from the city, state, or federal governments, except for some periodic project-based grants. We thank Rondout Savings Bank for their sponsorship of the lecture series. We also thank you for your contributions that help support the museum. If you have not already, please sign your name at the sign-up sheet we have in the front. There you can also leave your email address if you wish to be contacted about future lectures and events at the museum. The Hudson River Maritime Museum is located on the Rondout Creek, part of Lenape-Hoken, traditional home of Lenape. We recognize the painful history of forest removal, dispossession, cultural suppression, and attempted genocide of indigenous peoples. By collaborating with present-day Lenape communities, cultural bearers, and scholars, we are actively working to improve our exhibits, public programs, and educational resources, and help everyone better understand this important history. Just a few quick housekeeping things before we get started. Please save your questions or comments for the end of tonight's lecture. We will leave time at the end for a quick Q&A. For our virtual guests tonight, feel free to use the chat function to say hello and introduce yourselves, and to send any questions that you wish to have answered during our Q&A later this evening. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's guest. Frank Beres is an aquatic ecologist and naturalist based out of Port Ewan, New York, that has documented thousands of different species in Ulster County. He specializes in finding and photographing rare species of Odonata, dragonflies, and damselflies. Frank is passionate about biodiversity education and works to instill love and appreciation for all forms of life. Everyone, Frank Beres.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Michael. Very happy to be here to present this to you today. I love the Follow the River lecture series. I'm excited to be a part of it. So my presentation is called Seasons of Life here. And first, I want to go over what exactly does that mean. Everything I'm about to show you here tonight is either a description or a product of how observable life tracks with our area seasons. So this is really the study of phenology. And what that is cyclic and seasonal occurrences in nature and how that relates to climate and ecology. Phenology, yeah. And so I've always been interested in different life history strategies and the timing of events and how they happen throughout the year. So as we move through the seasons, what kind of biodiversity can we directly observe? But also, what are things doing when they're not observable? So let me introduce myself to you first. My name is Frank Beres. I'm a Hudson Valley ecologist, and I work locally, and I do something that I like to call naturalist photography. Now, this is not something that I made up. It's an offshoot of something called naturalistic photography, which was by Peter Henry Emerson in the 1800s, back when photos were black and white. And this was like direct, simple photography that showed real people in their environment. And it's a time when fake backdrops and poses and elaborate costumes were popular. But he considered it to be like the truest form of art. I think that really translates well today in our world of Instagram and filters and these over-processed images of, wildlife. Because scientifically, we want the truest representation of things as we see them. So I started with photography to better document my local species, and with some interesting finds throughout the year. And I would say, I should also say that he also later published a pamphlet with an ominous black border around it, and it was called The Death of Naturalistic Photography. But nevertheless, some of the ideals remained influential, even though he recanted everything he said about it. So I moved here in Connecticut in 2016 and began documenting species. And this presentation is made up of the approximately 25,000 photos since. And most of you already know this, but I need to temper your expectations a little because I specialize in things that fly, like birds and insects, and bioindicators. So I'm going to talk mostly about that. But there are a lot of other aspects that I will not cover that other very qualified people in the Hudson Valley would be able to talk to you about. This, yeah. There we go. So we want to look at, we have the beauty of nature and the different species, but the use of bioindicators is a practical way to tell us a lot about habitat quality. And this is where documentation is really important. To me, just arbitrarily, I felt like migrating warblers were kind of late this year and kind of slow. There's always some kind of variability amongst years. And all this is dependent on different climate and seasonal factors. But my goal here is to kind of take you through an entire year in this area. And this could really be something that anyone could replicate and do it themselves if they're interested. And I can tell you a few ways at the end. So of course, all these different species that come in are parts of complex ecological webs. Many depend on timing of the season. If you were to take certain species that live in water, you can look at which ones are tolerant and which ones are sensitive and create indices that tell you a lot about habitat quality. And of course, they're fun to look at as we have my wife and my daughter playing in a clean, healthy stream here. We want good habitat for our animals and for ourselves. So anyway, welcome to spring. This is the dog tick, of course, not the dreaded black-legged tick. These are most active from April to October, but the deer ticks can be active, year-round if you think about how active deer are year-round. But on warmer days above freezing, the adult deer ticks can be active and will bite you. I've definitely pulled ticks off of myself in February. But we're going to go heavy on spring. This is the most unpleasant part of the whole thing. But we're currently in the best, watchable wildlife kind of biodiversity explosion that we're on the cusp of. But when you start off in March, it still kind of feels like winter. So you might recognize this nest from nearby, and actually it's right there out the window. And this was from the last days of March each year. And these are the osprey pair that return each year. And these are very strongly faithful to both their partners and to their nest sites. And they spend a long time performing maintenance on the nest and mating and laying eggs. And the female performs most of the incubation and feeding of the young, while the male hunts fish. And these head back south in December. And these had heavy declines along with other birds in the 1960s due to the use of DDT and the eggshell thinning that caused. But once that was banned, the species and others started to make a comeback. And they went from endangered to threatened in 76, and then they were special concern by 1999. So this is one of the longest studied and monitored raptor species in the state of New York. You kind of have a similar situation with bald eagles, but they don't migrate as much. The osprey will spend a lot of time guarding their nests from them. They kind of do partial migrations, and in the winter months, they could group up on open water where there's food available. Once we hit late April or May, we start to see the first cues that winter might be over. The spring ephemerals are plants that are marked by a very short life cycle. A lot of them are in damp areas. And ephemeral means transitory or like quickly fading. It's a growth strategy. And, this kind of dormancy at times of the year when times are tough is a common strategy for many species of plants and animals. But when the conditions are right, they start to make a grand appearance. And these are important because a lot of native pollinators that come out on this time depend on plants like this. And some of them are even show a preference for a specific plant, which has been shown in things like trout lily here. Of course, you have the best time of the year, and that's the migration of warblers and allies through our area. This is a blue-gray gnatcatcher. I say warblers and allies as kind of a loose grouping. And these will persist through summer to our area, but they're a very interesting little bird that you can find flitting about stream sides, and they're very charismatic. And actually in the 1950s, these were considered uncommon. And there were very few pairs documented, mostly Long Island and NYC. And then over time, they start moving upwards as conditions become better for them, and they kind of expand their range. And in the 80s, you have hundreds of pairs being reported. And now, I mean, you can't go anywhere without seeing these little guys, and it's okay because they're delightful. Are they going to keep moving north afterwards? Are they going to? We'll have to see how the climate plays out. And of course, as I said, they're very charismatic little ones, and they're just a joy to find every year. Other birds come and visit too. We have a lot of spring feeder visitors like chipping sparrows, blue jay flocks, and cowbirds and catbirds, and this rose-breasted grosbeak, which always is one of my favorite times in the spring. But while they're here, the warblers themselves are a phenomenon that's like none other. Many of these travel thousands of miles, and mostly at night. And that's why there's been these initiatives to turn lights off in places with big skyscrapers and things that could get in the way of their migration. Because bird strikes on large buildings is a terrible hazard for them. Every year I have something called Warbler Weekend, and I just made this up myself. And actually last year I was sick for it. It was quite depressing, but Warbler Weekend actually is probably going to be this weekend. So I invite you all to come over and enjoy. They have very zipping songs, most of them. And I use this app by Cornell Labs called Merlin, which some people may have heard of, where you can get a good idea of what's around you by recording the song. It's not always right, but sometimes it is. This is a really cool thing that I got into recently. It's called Birdcast. And this is also by Cornell Lab and Colorado State University and UMass Amherst. And what it will do is look at weather patterns and movement and availability for movement, and it will predict how many birds might be migrating for the next few days. So this is actually for tonight, and there's 448 million birds predicted to be moving across the United States tonight. And you can see where we are in New York, it says low, but a low amount out of 450 million birds is still kind of a lot. So that's why I'm hoping for this weekend to be a big one for us. Also, I just really want it to be. There's a lot of different kinds, which makes them so fantastic. The one on the left is a little more uncommon. It's a worm-eating warbler. The prized find, the Blackburnian warbler. There's warbling vireos. There's palm warblers. There's ovenbirds. There's all kinds of loose groupings together when we mention warblers and allies. But we want to look at why they move when they do, and a lot of times it's based on weather conditions and photo period. There's also an interesting phenomenon called fallout, and that's when severe weather will prevent birds from reaching their desired destination, and they become exhausted and kind of hunker down in an area where you can get, it could be a very sought after event for birders where you'll have a stray bird basically that everyone will be going and trying to see. But ideally, they're moving because they're going to have an abundance of food when they arrive. Most are insectivores at this time of year. And when you go outside right now at this time of year, what do you have swarming your face wherever you go? These little dipterans and midges and gnats, and things like the stonefly, which inevitably become fish food. But there's a reason that they lay so many eggs and have so many individuals as part of their life strategy, because many of them get eaten. They're a very intricate part of this food web. So now welcome to your Entomology 101 class that you never signed up for. Things like birds and fish and others feed on these animals year round. So we can go through the life cycle here real quick, and we'll start with A up in the top right there, and that's the egg stage. When the egg hatches, you have several instars, which is a term for growth periods in these aquatic larvae where they molt their skins and they grow. Kind of like a lobster or something. And this is a case-making caddisfly, and you can see when you get down to the seas, it starts building a case out of little pieces of gravel and sticks. And eventually they pupate and come up to the surface and live as adults, where generally the cycle is they'll live underwater for a very long time and live for a very short time as an adult. But at every stage, you have ducks that feed on the larvae underwater, and then you have the warblers and flycatchers that feed on the adults that hatch out. So they're obviously an incredibly important aspect of intricate food webs all year. And this is just aquatic insects. I mean, terrestrial insects have their own cycles like this. The stereotypical ephemeral insect is the mayfly, of course, and these will start to occur throughout the warmer months. And they're known very well for their short adult lifespans as an ephemeral insect. And the shortest of all, actually, is a southern species, the Dillania americana. And the females emerge, they mate and they lay eggs, and then they die at the ripe old age of 5 minutes. So that's just as the adult stage. The males will emerge and cruise for mates along the river, or wherever they hatched out. But all of these are dead within 30 minutes of emerging as an adult. So that's why a synchronous emergence is so important. And there's a lot of factors to that, but they're all seasonal. It should be noted, though, that the larvae of these will live underwater for up to a year. So we have to look at life in a flow when we're talking about aquatic insects, because how can something live in a moving stream like this? And their bodies are completely designed to be able to hang on with the water rushing over them. So they utilize something called a viscous sublayer, and that's where the moving water, when it moves over an object, there's a very thin layer that is actually not moving due to viscosity. And so these insects are all very flattened, and they have hooks and projections that helps them hang on to that sublayer and the water rushes over them. There's many different species of aquatic insects. This is a damselfly larva. They all rely on different seasonal cues to emerge as adults. The case-making caddisflies we had in the diagram. If you look at these giant mayfly swarms that come out and make the news, where there's cars skidding everywhere and covering the gas stations and stuff, that's an essential food source a lot of times. It's an essential event every year. That's not an aquatic insect. I apologize. But the adult's emergence, do you know what kind that was? Yeah. Marble spring salamander. Thank you. The adult emergence for insects depend on things like water and air temperature, the length of photoperiod, or the duration of light in the day, 24-hour period. And photoperiodism is a physiological reaction of plants and animals that triggers these events. It's one of the reasons that our calendar lines up so well with biology. This is a stream cruiser. They're very easy to find in the early season. You can go to slab sides right now and find some. Interestingly, one of the first odonates, which dragonflies are an aquatic insect, to arrive in our area is the common green darner. And the common green darner is actually migratory. We talked about the warblers being migratory, but migration as a definition is the seasonal movement of animals from one habitat to another in search of food or conditions or reproductive needs. And on a global scale, climate factors can do things like extend growing seasons or change distribution patterns and alter the phenology of this type of event. Breeding and feeding and flowering and migration is really all connected. There's no point in migrating if what you're migrating for is not there, but you're probably not triggered to do it anyway. So warblers are not the only migrants. Green darners are one of the first dragonflies to appear in our area, but most of them did not hatch here. And this was a study from biology letters from the different generations where some will hatch early on in the year in the south and move up to where we are. And then they will lay eggs up here and they will start to move south. And then the third generation only stays in the south. So you can actually look at the occurrences of the green darner across an entire year each month. And you can see in the winter months, they're very restricted at the bottom. But as soon as March and May and June hit, you start to get a lot up here. This is the green darner. My wife had a comment. She said, "Oh, behave." This is my favorite dragonfly. It shows up in late spring and May and June. It's the Gomphiesha, or the harlequin darner. And I had to include this because now we're starting to move to the end of spring and we're moving into summer. And this is where my personal favorite specialty comes in, looking for dragonflies. And these are extremely friendly. Here you have one that landed on a book, and I identified the book as Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. So dragonflies are just like us. But I was on the edge of a pond with my lens and my boots walking around, and someone asked what I could possibly be looking for. And I said dragonflies, and she held her book and said, "Oh, I have one right here." And so I was able to talk about it and tell them how cool it was, and then he flew off. And don't let my wife ever tell you I don't take any photos of her, because obviously I do. This is one of the largest moths in our area, which is also one of my favorites and one of the most recognizable ones that we have. The largest that we do have in our area is the 6-inch long Cecropia moth, but this is the Luna moth. They're not particularly uncommon, but the adults really only have a week-long lifespan, and they're mostly nocturnal, so they're kind of hard to find, unless you find them hung up during the day like this. They have vestigial mouth parts as adults and no digestive systems at all. The adults basically mate and lay eggs and die. And that's a very common strategy for a lot of these insects that we're talking about. The same is true for mayflies. And this was also taken literally right out this window right here yesterday. So it's hyper local. Yeah, but insects become more prevalent as we approach the summer, and birding kind of tones down because the migrants continue north up to the Adirondacks and up into the boreal forests. And we, of course, keep some species around, warblers and wading birds and others. But here we have a freshly hatched cicada, one of the harbingers of summer. And some of these are annual and some are periodical, which you've probably all heard before. But what would summer be without hearing their call in the trees? Just as aquatic insects spend their lives in water, these spend most of their lives on the ground. This is a very interesting find from last year that kind of ties in with the climate changes and weather changes. It's a Ramber's forktail. It's a distinct type of damselfly. And when I came across this, I was in field at Chaupanique. And it's one of those instances where if you learn the common species well enough, the rare ones will kind of stick out to you, the uncommon ones. Because I've never actually seen a Ramber's forktail in person. And the reason for that is that they've only been documented in New York, in Long Island. And it looks like one unvouchered one way out west. But in Ulster County, we're about 90 miles north of these previous documentations for this species. And when we're talking about migratory insects, we generally don't include damselflies, because if you've ever seen one fly, they're very poor. They're not poor flyers, but they have this very fluttering flight. They're not zooming like a green darner. So you have to start to wonder if this is out of range because no one's been looking for it, or is it undergoing a range expansion, much like the other creatures that we've had over the past 50 years or so. So with differing temps and conditions, you'll be able to collect more observations of this. And I've seen this in a few other kind of damselflies, especially. And I get these charts from the New York Natural Heritage Program Dragonfly and Damselfly Survey, which is a 5-year-long survey documenting each county in the state. That's their entire range, so it's mostly a coastal southeastern species and a little bit in central. So these changes over the season affect the habitats too. And we become more susceptible to things like flooding at certain times of the year. But the habitat, of course, is just as important as the species needs. It's one of the essential ones, and especially when you're out looking for them. Usually you don't go out looking for a species, you go out looking for a habitat and hoping that you find it, like a bog maybe, or a stream like this. So this here would be I would be able to identify as a snaketail habitat. And it's basically a pristine forested stream with rocky boulder banks and gravel and shifting sandbars. And they always usually have higher water quality, being a forested, undisturbed stream like this. Little is known about the larvae of snaketails, but I imagine they probably bury and ambush in the sand. But these are some of the species in our state that are the most assessed as being the most vulnerable. And it's one of the really coolest groups of dragonflies there is, as they will just cruise around these streams and they have these emerald green colors. But I often use dragonflies as kind of a model organism because some of these are sensitive and some are tolerant and some migrate. And many of these species become of special concern where they have certain assessments which have led them to be vulnerable or threatened. You really have to look at the right time of the year with the right conditions out. So I'll look at the temperatures and the weather, and really mostly I get lucky. But this is Spatterdock darner, which is the New York Natural Heritage Program ranked S2. And what that would mean, that's the second highest ranking. So that is imperiled with 6 to 20 known populations very few individuals, a restricted range or habitat, and steep declines. So it's possible to come across these when you're out in your travels. Just got to keep your eyes open. But summer, of course, is a time for great diversity and abundance, and these ecological webs perform at their maximum. We have more abundance than any other time of year, even if the biodiversity changes over the year. But environmental factors affect all this. So if we have longer, drier periods, the effects will be seen. The summer starts to bring out some behavioral adaptations too. This mating pair of spread wings, the male stays attached to the female as the female deposits eggs into streamside plants and lakeside plants. And in case you couldn't tell, my particularly interest is in odinates, but if you learn these common species, you can recognize the rare, and the importance of documentation can't be understated, no matter what kind of group someone might be interested in. Here's another example of behavioral adaptation to deal with the summer heat. And this is a blue dasher, which is all over the place, a male. And this one is pointing its abdomen straight up at the sun to reduce the amount of light that is striking its body. And that's a way of regulating heat. So this is called obelisking. There's a lot of unique adaptations like this amongst species. These swallowtails are puddling. I find these very commonly in parking lots of hiking trails and Catskills and damp areas. They will absorb the nutrients and the salts from the soil. And of course, as the summer progresses, we have new flowers blooming and new pollinators flourishing. And these swallowtails have really been around since spring, but in the spring, I didn't have these daylilies popping up in my garden, which is a non-native plant, but what are you going to do? They pop up everywhere. They're all over the place. So these are some of the more familiar butterflies that we have, and this is a spicebush swallowtail. We have tiger swallowtails and black ones. And also other pollinators too are abundant in the summer, hummingbirds and bees. And this one is on our zinnias in that same garden. But streamside, you'll see native plants like jewelweed or cardinal flowers are highly attractive to these pollinators and other species as well. If you really want to find some butterfly diversity in this area, you can go to the Catskill Center Thorn Preserve in Woodstock, where it's home to at least 32 different species of butterflies. And a lot of the reason behind that is the plant diversity that they have there. Baltimore checker spot during the caterpillar stage it goes on this English and common plantain, which is not easy to find, I guess. But the adults will feed on other flowers as well. But it emphasizes the importance of a diverse habitat and the resiliency of these plants to be able to come up and host this life every year. This is a little absolute fluff of cotton candy, the rosy maple moth. If you leave your porch lights on at this time of year in the summer, you'll have amazing visitors. But of course, applied entomology studies have suggested that artificial light can suppress the activity of some nocturnal flyers and possibly alter other parts of their life cycles. So you don't want to be doing it too much. Some of these birds persist through summer, like these indigo buntings. Many will move on farther north, but these are really lovely to listen and see. And they would be one of the most abundant songbirds in brushy pastures and wooded edges. The males are more commonly seen as the dull females are tending to eggs deep in dense thickets. Chopinique Ridge, again, the lower field is a great place to find these. I see a bunch every year. They occasionally visit my feeders. And documentation is not always that easy. This is the only photo of a Swift river cruiser that I've ever been able to get. So it's kind of like looking for Bigfoot. Unfortunately, after long months of hunting, things start to get very hot. We run into this thing that I like to call the midsummer doldrums. This is not a scientific term. It's really the post-peak of kind of biodiversity explosion. You leave a lot of time to sit in these ailing milkweed pods and think about all the things you missed over the year and why didn't you get a good photo back in May. And how come you can't catch a wandering glider? And how are my actions affecting these ecosystems at small levels? And what am I going to do for 6 months of winter? But you never know, because you could come across anything at any time, anywhere. So this is a tiger spiketail, which is an S1 critically imperiled dragonfly with few populations, and very rare in our state. These are the previous documented records. This was the first one for Ulster County. But the interesting thing about this one, across its range, it does not have a very big range at all. So it's rare across its entire range in this case. But the interesting thing about this one is I found it in September. So it was about a month and a half after previously recorded records for this in the state. So it always pays to keep your eyes open, even when you're depressed in the midsummer doldrums. Luckily, in the fall, we have mosaic darners to the rescue. This is a late summer into fall group that forms these gigantic feeding swarms. Some of you might be familiar with over open fields and lakes. It's hard to catch them perched, as they have endless amounts of energy in the strong sun. They form these big swarms with other species of dragonflies, even all the gnats and midges and stuff that rises up from the fields there. It's a little off topic, but mosaic darners are not the easiest to identify. Usually you want to look at the thoracic stripes for the ID. Like on top, we have a green striped darner, which has a little flag at the top of its thoracic stripe. On the bottom, we have the Canada darner, which has a deeply notched stripe, which is mostly blue. So it's some of the intricacies. This is another swarmer, which is might be my last dragonfly of the presentation, as it's one of the last ones of the year. This is Pantala fulvescens, the wandering glider, and the name means something like all wing in Latin. And this has its widest range around the world, around the 40th parallel, in both hemispheres. So they go a little higher north in North America, but they're on every continent except Antarctica. They're in Hawaii, and they're highly migratory. They have the longest distance traveled of any insect. They cross the Indian Ocean on the their highest record ever was at 6,200 meters in the Himalayas. But somehow we only recorded this in Ulster County a few years ago. So it stresses the importance of trying to document and learn these different species. So around this time of year, the wandering gliders belongs to a group called the rainpool gliders. And what this dragonfly is doing, it's tapping on the hood of this car as the reflective light makes it think that it is a temporary rain pool. So it's actually trying to lay eggs on the top of this car, which is kind of depressing, but these have been around for a very long time. So enough of them do succeed. A great place to find these are in the Lowe's parking lot in Kingston. Also ShopRite parking lot's a really good one, but you get a lot of weird looks when you're walking around with your dragonfly net in the ShopRite parking lot. And, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to go back there anymore, actually. By the second week of November, we really only have the meadowhawks that remain, the autumn meadowhawks. You can see the damage that the wings have taken over time, and they're gone shortly after. I do take baby photos too. I'm available for parties and weddings, but you might get some very interesting results. We should be thankful, though, for the species that are with us year-round into the late autumn. It's a perfect opportunity to kind of get photos of them that capture the autumn backdrop and just the wonderful colors. Of course, we have the fall migrants coming back through. So this is a black-poll warbler, and it's feasting on these tiny dipterans that you can kind of see in the video here. And they eat these things, these midges and these gnats, and they're really fueling up for their trip back south. But sometimes they don't make it out in time. And like we said earlier, the weather phenomenon might stop them and they hunker down in place. So this was a yellow-throated warbler that took up residence at my friend's house for a while near the beginning of last winter. And we're not actually sure what came of it because it stopped showing up. So you just have to hope that there becomes a certain point in time where they're not going to be able to fly away unless they're kind of going from feeder to feeder, which would be very difficult. But we do want to be appreciative of these year-round species because otherwise winter would be very, very boring for someone like me. But just as we see behavioral adaptations that deal with heat, on the coldest days, birds will fluff out their feathers in order to trap air underneath their layers of feathers and warm it up via body heat. So this is a very prevalent bird in our area, which was introduced quite a while back. It's the European starling. They're very prevalent, but they're also the ones that survive, and they're able to survive our harsh climate without having a migration pattern or these cues. But we take nothing for granted. We have American tree sparrows, which is a native species that is on this invasive Phragmites, using it for whatever their purpose is. Not quite sure, because it's not really nesting season. This was in the winter. They might be eating the seeds. Not totally sure, but these species adapt, and so do we. I think that we really learn and we grow through kind of documenting this stuff and gaining the understanding of how life around us is adapting. This is especially important in like a changing climate and landscape. It's not all quite so somber. If you notice, cardinals are super red in the winter, and it's not really just the white background that makes them look this way. They've molted several times over the year, and it's usually kind of tipped with gray, giving more of a dullish red appearance, but they're preparing a new set of feathers in time for the spring breeding season. This was an interesting one we had last winter. So we do get weird cases up here in Ulster County pretty often. And the cardinal actually is a recent bird of the Northeast. The range only expanded to include New York and New England in the 1900s. I think within the last 50 years from what I could find. And so this is kind of just like we saw in the damselflies earlier with range expansions and being able to adapt to these differing climates. This particular cardinal had this mottled orange kind of tie-dyed appearance that we saw, I think, in January of last year. And it was disputed, the reasons, but probably a lack of carotenoids, which give it that reddish color. And those come from like red and purple berries and fruits. One of their native original foods was honeysuckle, where they have these red berries and they feast upon them, and it gives them their color. This also, emphasizes the importance of documentation, but also the importance of having habitat and native plantings if you're going to be doing stuff like that. Of course, as weather starts to become more extreme, we'll probably see more goldfinches on 2-inch branches encased with 2 inches of ice. These branches actually stood straight up on this tree. This was during the ice storm last year. So that was quite a time for us, a destructive time for us. Goldfinch, their plumage throughout the year actually changes. And they have their full breeding plumage where they're bright yellow in August, in the summer and August. And they're more dull in the winter months. So if you're at home and you're in a pandemic, or maybe you're retired and you're not sure what month it is, you can always look outside at the goldfinches and they'll be able to tell you. So while we do have the usual residents, sometimes we have some lucky winters where we have these finch eruptions. That's a sudden surge of unexpected species that move farther down south, in our case, outside of their typical range. And the reasons can vary amongst species, but usually it's caused, the levels of eruption can be predicted by analyzing the stocks of spruce cones and mountain ash berries in the boreal forests of Canada. So if there's not enough food, the birds have to venture south to look for more. And there's always a chance to get a few of these every winter, but this is a wonderful evening grosbeak. These were some red poles at my house in February 2021 that came back every day for about a month. When we get to winter, often bird watching is one of our best and only options for naturalism in the season. But these were delightful to watch. They would go to my feeder and empty it out and then move on to someone else's, probably empty that out and then come back. And it was just really nice to hear their little calls and their songs for the entire winter. Along with them was a more uncommon one. And this was a hoary redpoll, an Arctic redpoll, which had mixed in with the flock. And some people may have come over to our house to see it, actually. And this was a documented first sighting for Ulster County in the proof age, where you need pics or it didn't happen, or you have to log it on eBird and things like that. But this attracted dozens of birders every day to my house. And it was quite the spectacle. I made a lot of new friends. And it was probably the best winter I've ever had. The purple finch is more common than the others, and I tend to see them at the beginning and the end of the seasons. Into spring, we had a really good amount of them moving through this year. But you get a lot of unique opportunities in the winter. You know, I've seen birds that were flown off course and far from home, and I've also spent a lot of times with the every yearly species that stick around. And it's nice to think about this kind of stuff when conditions are so difficult in the winter. You see these cheerful little birds that are willing to come eat peanuts out of your hand. It's really quite nice. But you know, just as in the summer, naturalists and nature lovers might experience the winter doldrums. This is a good time to, you know, think about our actions, and something like that might be the ethics of bird feeding that often crosses my mind. You know, what's your initial reaction that the birds are going to become dependent on humans in order to survive? But I've not quite found this to be the case, because these birds will really only come eat out of our hands in the winter when conditions are extremely tough. And you have to wonder if you might be offsetting the ecological modifications, anthropogenic modifications that we've made. Is it really so bad to go feed the birds a little bit? Because I kind of don't think so. But, you know, think about having my daughter here at an early age feed these chickadees out of her hand in the snow. It's like helping to instill this lifelong appreciation that will carry on, that she can carry on to others, and hopefully carry this on for the rest of her life. You know, it might cause one to be cognizant of these ecological impacts of your actions and your decisions. So I say spread appreciation and feed the birds. There's quite a few that stay around. Eastern bluebird will stay around year round. Some robins will, but they'll be hard to find. They kind of flock together. We start to approach the end of winter and the end of our year-long trip here. We start to see a lot of blackbird flocks. And if anyone heard these noisy choruses over the last few weeks, and they've moved on now to different wetlands and other habitat. And they still flock together, but they don't kind of come and assault bird feeders as much anymore. It's usually these common grackles, red-winged blackbirds, brown-headed cowbirds, and starlings will all mix in, with the occasional oddball. But as the winter begins to relent and we start to experience these warmer days, one of my favorite things to do at the end of the winter is look for these overwintering butterflies that emerge on sunny days. And there's a few species that do this. This one is the mourning cloak, which occurs in the northern hemisphere, in North America and Eurasia. In the UK, they call it the Camberwell beauty. But it has one of the longest lifespans of any butterfly, which is up to a year. They have several broods during the year, but the adults will hibernate over the winter in tree crevices and under loose bark. And once you start to see these, the next thing that you know, the spring ephemerals are probably right around the corner. So I have a few resources here if you're interested in further learning. In Ulster County, the John Burroughs Natural History Society is a wonderful organization that offers dozens of guided walks every year. I give a few dragonfly walks for them, as well as the John Burroughs Association, which is the literary society. And I have some handouts there with the dates for this year's walks. iNaturalist, eBird, Odonata Central are all documenting websites. So they're tracking websites. If you want to see what you find and you want to track it somewhere, you can use any one of these. Dragonfly Society of the Americas and Ducks Unlimited Canada really do a lot of dragonfly work, but they do a lot of habitat work, which is super important in our field. Locally, we have Scenic Hudson, which has a lot of nice programs and articles and blogs. And the Hudson River Almanac is one of my favorite emails that I get every week. Every Friday, you basically get these records that people have submitted anywhere along the Hudson River. And if you see something interesting, or, you know, if you just see something normal that you thought was cool, you can submit it to the Almanac, and it compiles them weekly. And it's really a cool resource. And of course, your friends and your neighbors. I actually was referred here by my neighbor, Ron Searle, who also was the one who told me there was a Luna moth right outside here yesterday. And I ran down here and met up with him and got it. So I do want to say thank you to Ron. You know, of course, you say act local. And of course, all of you. So we're very lucky to live in this area. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know. I did include something that was not an aquatic insect. What was that? Sure. No further questions. So yes, how long I have to wait to get some of these shots? It's really patience is really key. Sometimes you'll be lucky and you'll have a kind of a hot day right out of you get out of your car, you immediately start seeing things you want to take photos of. And then some days you're trampling over things and scaring them off before you even got to them. So some of it is most of it is patience, and some of it is having the right equipment for what you're looking for. So when you're looking for warblers, they're always very far away and they're up in the tops of the trees, and you need a very long lens. And even then, it's kind of like this little blob in the middle of your screen. But with patience, and sometimes they start to come down to the lower branches. It might take a while, and it might not happen at all. So a lot of times, I'd say about 90% of my trips are moderately unsuccessful. But that's a conservative estimate. 85. Oh yes, this was about the app that identifies the calls. That's the Merlin app from Cornell Labs, and you basically hold it, start recording, hold it up in the air, don't make any sound, and it do its best to match up the audiogram or whatever it is to known bird species. And, it works really well, but sometimes it'll confuse different things that are happening at the same time if you're in a really noisy area. So you have to take it with kind of a grain of salt. And it says, if it says something that's super uncommon, it will have a little mark on it that's like, this is really uncommon. So you want to try to confirm what you have visually, which is not always easy. What do you recommend? Right. So this question was about artificial light and the effects and what to do at in your yard. I'd say the biggest impacts come from things like, giant construction lights that are really, next to a stream you see mayflies swarming around. You could make the argument that gets them closer together if they're going to be mating or something like that. But the mechanics of this is really not super well known. So different types of lights will affect moths, for example, in different ways. Some may be less harmful than others, like LED lights are probably less harmful to moths than I can't remember the other type, but mercury vapor or things like that. But when we're trying to attract moths for a scientific study and we're out in the middle of the field with a sheet up and a light on it, we use special lights that they will be more attractive. So, but as for the optimal setting, I mean, with all our development, it's really hard to come up with a solution for that. We would need something really on a large scale, which doesn't mean that's not being studied, because it definitely is. What's your question? When the flies eat the what? In the light. Oh, that's a very good point. My daughter Audrey just made a point that attracting bugs to your porch lights could cause them to be eaten a lot more. Think about toads that hang out over a porch light, or spiders or something like that. You're basically leaving them to be devoured very easily, which is good for the toads and the spiders. Not so good for the flies, huh? Yes, exactly. Okay, for this we have a bird feeder recipe. How much time do we have left? Okay, yeah, and how much money do you have? It becomes very expensive after a while if you're doing this daily. What I'll use is I will buy shelled peanuts and unshelled peanuts. Blue jays prefer peanuts in the shell. They'll really load up on them and fly off. And if you can take care of the blue jays and get rid of them, the other birds will come down and eat the peanuts that are out of the shell. The fruit and nut mixes, I'll add that to that. So it has things like safflower seeds and unshelled sunflower seeds. And I also have a black oil sunflower feeder that has like a mesh, and the squirrels will demolish that every day if you leave it up. Yeah, yes, the naughty squirrels. You're absolutely right. The other thing that I use for the finches, as we saw in that yellow feeder there, is a very thin thistle seed. That's mixed in. You can buy something called a finch mix, and that will be mixed in with very small sunflower seeds and these little white millets. I think they're called canary seed. And you can buy a mix of that. And if all the other feeders are empty, I'll see everything go to that. If all the other feeders are full, only the finches go to it. It's really quite impressive. So, yep. And there's more out there. Experiment. But black oil sunflower seed, you can never go wrong. All right. Thank you.
That looks like all the time we have for now. If you have any additional questions, you can email us at education@hrmmm.org in chat. Thank you so much, Frank, for joining us. Our next lecture will be hybrid, virtual, and in person on Wednesday, June
7th.
From Sail to Steam to Diesel with Hillary Russell and Thad Cubis. This lecture was recorded and will be available on YouTube in the near future. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time.